on the World Bank. Today is a very special session. We'll hear all about the report. We have very distinguished panelists and speakers. Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi and Dr. Roberta Gatti will be giving the opening remarks. Then we'll be hearing about the report from Dr. Asif Islam and Dr. Federico Bennett. And following the presentation, we'll be hearing from our lead commentators, Dr. Maya Sebrending and Dr. Adel Ben Youssef. With that, I give the floor to Dr. Ibrahim to start the session, please.
Many thanks, Shireen. It gives me great pleasure, really, to say a few words at the opening of this webinar on the most recent report of the Office of the Chief Economist at the MENA region about altered destinies in the Middle East and North Africa as a result of the shocks associated with COVID-19 and the subsequent ongoing war on Ukraine, and the ramification of that for the welfare and future of societies in the Middle East and North Africa in the context of the macroeconomic impact traced through the inflationary shock and pass through to the level of households and access to food, and how this impact the food security and access to food, especially for cohort of children, and the potential impact on the probability of stunting. And therefore, the title, Altered Destiny, is really well-articulated and highly relevant title. This actually presentation and our hosting as Economic Research Forum of this important report is part and parcel of the collaboration and partnership between the World Bank at large, especially the Office of the Chief Economist and the Middle East and North Africa region at the World Bank, since the World Bank is a founding institution among four institutions that founded or sponsored the ARF back in 1993, and ever since the World Bank continues to support the creation of knowledge in the form of micro data accessible to all researchers, and the deployment of that data in terms of research and supporting capacity building, as well as, of course, policy making in the region. In particular, I like this report because it's a report that combines macroeconomic, serious macroeconomic research and how it plays out at the microeconomic level, using creative techniques that has a policy purpose. And I think in our region, macro has always been the elephant in the room. But in terms of communicating the consequences of macro mismanagement, I find this report most effective, because saying that macroeconomic mismanagement reduces growth or just even inflation and so on is not really as influential as bringing that to the doorsteps of families and communities, that your children and the future of your children will be severely impacted. So I think this report is very important, and we look forward to, I think, articulating this report over and over in various forums in the region, so as to highlight the importance of economic reform, and also hopefully to alter the political economy that influences policymaking in our region. So without further ado, I would like to congratulate actually Roberta and her colleagues, Federico and Asif, and look forward to their presentation, as well as, of course, to the commentary from our capable lead commentators. So over to you.
Roberta.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim and Dr. Shireen, for the kind hospitality. And it has now become a tradition that the Middle East and North Africa Chief Economist Office has the privilege to present to the ERF audience the biannual MENA economic update. As Dr. Ibrahim indicated, the title is Altered Destinies. And what we're looking at in this report are the long-term effect of inflation on food insecurity and human capital accumulation in our region. Before I say a couple of words of what are some of the key angles that we approach, I really want to say that it takes a village to put together twice a year a report that has a part on the macroeconomic story of the region, and then it has a spotlight, which, as Dr. Ibrahim has indicated, this time around focuses on food insecurity. And I wanted to acknowledge the authors, Daniel Lederman, Asif Islam, and Federico Bennett, who will be, Asif and Federico will be the presenters, Bo Andre, Oda Assem, Rana Lofty, and Menda Musa, but also the work that and the collaboration that went on with all the country economists of the countries in our region in the Middle East and North Africa to arrive at growth projections. And while I'm on the case of growth projection, the one thing that I wanted to mention and that you will see from the presentation is that our region comes from a growth spurt in 2022, which brought it at real GDP growth at 5.8%. But what we forecast for 2023 is convergent to what is essentially the forecast for the global economy of 3%. So quite a big drop. Dr. Ibrahim was talking about the elephant in the room being the macroeconomics of the region. And I think it's a bit of a family of elephants. And part of this family is the question of inflation. And so the report focuses on inflation and sort of looks at it, I think, in a quite nuanced way, but particularly looks at the distributive implications of inflation, because we know that the poor are hit the most, and at the impact of food inflation. And this is where the macro transitions into the micro. And so you will see some estimates of how food inflation is likely to impact the health of children, both in utero and small children, and what are the implications for human capital accumulation in the future. There's also something quite interesting, and our colleague Bo Andre can speak more of it if there is time at the end, but we also have some forecasts for the future about food insecurity in our region, and those have been constructed with machine learning, new machine learning techniques that might be of interest to our audience. But I don't want to steal the thunder from the presentation, so let me stop here and turn to my colleague, Asif Islam, who will start the presentation and then pass it on to Federico. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Roberta. Asif, the floor is yours.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect. It needs to be perfect.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Roberta, for the introduction. So my name is Asif Islam, and I will be presenting together with my colleague Federico Bennett on the MENA economic update for April 2023, titled Altered Destinies, the Long-Term Effects of Rising Prices and Food Insecurity in MENA. First, a big thank you to the team for all their hard work in getting this report done. And of course, a massive thank you to Roberta and Danielle for guiding us through this process. As Roberta mentioned, our semi-annuals come in two parts. There's a part one that focuses on the macro update of the region, and a part two that's a thematic chapter, which for this time we chose the long-term effects of food insecurity in the region. So just to start off, I'll give the main results for the whole report so that you get an idea. You get an idea of what our key messages are. So from here, from what we can see from our macro projections is that growth rate for MENA will slow down in 2023 after the oil windfalls of 2022 that largely benefited GCC economies. So in 2022, MENA had a growth rate of 5.8%, and this will go down to 3%, or forecasted to be 3% in 2023. And this is largely because of the GCC economies that had a growth rate of about 7.3% in 2022 and is forecasted to fall to about 3.2% in 2023. Now, this is amidst high inflation. The region's inflation rate rose dramatically in 2022, and food inflation rose even faster. When we look at March to December 2022, which is right after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, food inflation year on year was 29%, while headline inflation year on year was 19.4%. The key message of our report is that rising food prices, even if they are temporary, pose severe challenges for the region, and this may last for generations. And this challenge compounds an already inadequate child nutrition and health data pre-COVID-19. So we lack a lot of data when it comes to child nutrition and health. We also look at the current state of food insecurity in the developing MENA region, and we see that it deteriorated. The share of severely food insecure population increased from 11.8% in 2006 to 17.6% in 2023. And this is largely due to the situation in Syria and Yemen. In terms of policies, we urge immediate action. We must act now. The cost of inaction compounded over many future generations would be much higher. And we discussed a range of policy options, including better targeted cash and in-kind transfers, building resilient food systems, better care for mothers, and improved data. So now I'll hand it over to my colleague, Federico Bennett, who will discuss part one on the macroeconomic outlook.
Thank you very much, Asif. So to start the macroeconomic outlook part of the report, we're going to first talk about growth. And so what you see here is the cumulative growth. Here on the left-hand side, we see the cumulative growth of MENA since 2021 into forecast to 2024, depicted in the dark red line, vis-a-vis the world represented in yellow. And straight off the bat, we see the two things that both Roberta and Asif mentioned. We see that MENA as a whole grew much faster in 2022 compared to the rest of the world at 5.8%, but is expected to experience a fairly sharp deceleration, and that we see as the growth path curve flattens out into 2023 with forecasts at about 3%. Now, as I've hinted to just now, we know that both the growth in 2022, this extraordinary growth, and the sharp deceleration is not distributed evenly across the region. And so the panel on the right shows the growth path of country groups. And indeed, we see that both the extraordinary growth in 2022 and the sharp deceleration into 2023 is mostly concentrated in the GCC, here represented by the dark brown curve that arches on the top of this graph. On the other end of the spectrum, we have developing oil importers that posted fairly low growth at 1.9% in 2022. And I have to note that this excludes Egypt, that is here depicted by the dashed black line. We put Egypt aside and represented it on its own because it represents a little bit of an outlier with respect to the rest of the group, with growth forecasted, with growth in 2022 calendar year at 4.2% and forecasts for calendar year 2023 at 3.6. But I must say that this, comparatively higher growth forecasts for Egypt are surrounded by a fair amount of uncertainty. If we look at private sector forecasts, we'll see that forecasts range anywhere from 2% to 4.5% for 2023. So that's a caveat there. So we see this diverging story within the region. And to dig a little bit deeper, we actually leverage the higher frequency of private sector forecasts to see how these evolved throughout last year. And specifically, we're interested in looking at how since February 2022, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine occurred, how the different country groups forecast for 2022 on the left and 23 on the right evolved throughout the year. The panel on the left, we see that very clearly the GCC depicted in orange and other oil exporters depicted in gray, their forecasts for 2022 were revised upwards immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February last year. On the other hand, we see that developing oil importers' forecasts for 2022 were revised downward. And these revisions were quite significant. We see that by December last year, GCC countries were revised upwards by 2 percentage points with respect to their February forecast, while oil importers were revised downwards by over 1 percentage point. When we look at forecasts made for 2023 and how these evolved since February last year, we see kind of a similar story, at least up until October. That is, we see that GCC and other oil exporters were revised upwards, while oil importers' forecasts for 2023 were revised downwards. In October, however, we see some sort of reversion on part of oil exporters, as it became clear that the oil windfalls were going to be shorter lived than previously anticipated. We see that their forecasts were revised downwards consistently up until the latest data available. So that was growth. Let me switch gears now and talk a little bit about inflation in the region. The graph here is probably the hardest graph of the whole presentation, so I'm going to just take it step by step. What you see here is for countries across the region. In the dark red bars, we see the average year-on-year inflation between October 2021 and February 2022. So think of this as the post-pandemic, but before Russia's invasion of Ukraine inflation. In yellow, in the next slide, we have the average year-on-year food inflation from there seems to be some missing transitions, but in this slide we have what's not here, unfortunately, due to technical issues. We see that if we looked at the year-on-year inflation from March 2022 to December 2022, there we go. We would see that across the board in the region, inflation has risen, and in some cases quite substantially. Now, I must note at the very right, you'll notice Iran and Lebanon are set aside and are to be read on the right-hand side scale due to their, unfortunately, very, very high levels of inflation, both before and after February last year. Now, one thing that we single out in the report is the role that exchange rates played in determining domestic inflation. This is because even if we have no change in the international prices of traded goods, if a country's currency depreciates, we will still experience an increase in the prices in domestic currency. And so one exercise that we tackled in the report is trying to account for this. And so we came up with an exchange rate adjusted level of inflation, here depicted in blue. And we see that in some cases, Egypt, notably Tunisia, Morocco, West Bank and Gaza, a large part of the inflation in domestic currency was due to exchange rate depreciation. Now, given that the main topic or the thematic spotlight of the report is going to be on food insecurity, we take a closer look at what's happening with the prices of food products. And so in the next figure here, we are showing the inflation of food items. And we see that just like headline inflation in the previous slide, food inflation has increased almost without exception across the board in the MENA region, in some cases quite substantially. Now, what you can maybe take note here is that double-digit food inflation was not uncommon at all in the region. And if we were to compare headline inflation to food inflation in the next slide, we would see that most countries indeed experience higher food inflation than headline inflation. Here we have food inflation on the vertical axis, headline inflation on the horizontal, and for reference, that dotted black line is the 45-degree line. Any country above this line indeed experienced higher food inflation than headline inflation. And this was the case for all of the countries considered, barring Jordan and Qatar. Now, why do we care about food inflation in particular? Well, we know that the poorest households are the ones that are less shielded from inflation generally. But when it comes to food inflation, they are particularly exposed. And this comes from the fact that poorer households spend a proportionately larger share of their expenditure on food products. And so to quantify this exposure, we've employed survey data, household survey data, to try to construct consumer price index that's like based on expenditure shares of the poorest households and of the richest households separately. So we can essentially calculate the inflation experienced by the poorest and the rich separately. And so this figure here shows in the red bars the inflation experienced by the poor, given their consumption patterns, relative to the inflation experienced by the median household, given their expenditure shares. That is the inflation of the poor minus the inflation of the median household. That's in red. And we see that across the board, this number is positive, implying that the poor experienced higher inflation than the median. The yellow bars show the same quantity, but for the richest households. And we'll see that this quantity is negative, so that the richest households experienced less inflation than the median household. That is the total span of each bar, that is from the top of the red bar to the bottom of the yellow bar. That is the difference of the inflation experienced at the supermarket, right, of the poor versus the rich. And we see that main takeaway here, the dashed lines are the average across these countries. Across developing MENA, on average, the poorest households experience 2 percentage points or about 2 percentage points higher inflation than the rich. Now, this is particularly worrisome given that the poor are also the ones that are most vulnerable to being food insecure. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to my colleague Asif, where he's going to discuss what the potential long-term impact of food insecurity could be in the region. Thank you.
Thanks, Fede. So I'll be talking on part 2 of which is on the lasting impact of food insecurity. And this is the main narrative. So food price inflation is not just an immediate concern because of its effect on children. We know from the medical literature that the first 1,000 days are important for a child's physical and brain development. And so when you have malnutrition in utero or early childhood, it can increase the risk of stunting, which is a measure for height for age. This can then have lasting negative effects on health, education, and income outcomes well into adulthood. And there's a large economics literature that has documented this. More importantly, these effects can be intergenerational. That is, the adults who are affected at birth, their children could be affected as well. So one thing we try and do in this report is try to look at the effects of the rise in food prices after Russia's invasion of Ukraine for the MENA region. Over here, what you see is the flowchart that sort of maps and spells this out really well. So you have exposure to food inflation in utero, its effect on the probability of stunting, and then its effect on years of schooling and harmonized test scores. So what we did was we looked at the literature to figure out what the effect of month-to-month food inflation is on under 5 stunting probabilities. And we looked for peer-reviewed published literature, and we also looked for the more conservative estimates. We then took this and looked at the food inflation month-to-month from March to June 2022, which is 4 months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and compared it to 3 counterfactuals. The first counterfactual is the month-to-month average inflation for 2019, which you could argue is pre-pandemic. And then you have the month-to-month inflation for 2021, which is a second counterfactual, which is essentially the inflation post-pandemic in some ways. And we looked at the 4 months as our the third counterfactual was 4 months before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we had those 3 counterfactuals for comparisons. And what we found is that the increase in the food prices after Russia's invasion of Ukraine for those 4 months after, from March to June, may have resulted in additional 200,000 to 285,000 children at risk of being stunted, which translates to about an increase in the risk of stunting by 17 to 24%. This, of course, then has effects on the use of schooling, and we see about a loss of between 3 weeks to a month and about a 0.5 to 0.8% drop in test scores. Of course, this can then have effects well onto adulthood. Now, it's important to note that, the child health and nutrition in MENA was already wanting or inadequate pre-pandemic. Over here, what you have on the y-axis is the percentage of children under 5 stunted, and we only include survey estimates here, not modeled estimates. And on the x-axis, you have the level of development. So not surprisingly, what you see here is that richer economies have lower rates of stunting, but also what's interesting is that a lot of the MENA countries perform worse than their income peers. You see high stunting rates in Yemen, Libya, and Syria, and this predates the conflict in these economies. What's also interesting is that when you go down to the right, you see that even when it comes to rich economies in the MENA region, they tend to underperform when compared to their income peers. Now, some of this could be due to dated data like in Bahrain and Qatar, But also where we have more recent data like Oman and Kuwait, we see the same results. Now, since we wrote this report, there have been some updates. Saudi Arabia has had a more recent survey, so has Morocco, and so has Kuwait, but the results don't change. They're pretty much the same as we show here. Now, the criteria of what surveys we look at is based on the Joint Child Malnutrition Estimates database, and they essentially do a lot of screening to look at very accurate estimates and the surveys they're based on. Now, of course, these averages don't tell you the full story, and things may differ within a country between poor and rich households. So what we do is we look at the prevalence of stunting by wealth quintiles, and we display this in panel A and panel B. So you have the first quintile, which is essentially the poorest household, and you have the fifth quintile, which is the richest households. And as you can see in this graph, there's a meaningful difference between the first quintile and fifth quintile when it comes to stunting rates. There's also a difference in some cases between the first quintile, which is the poorest, and the second quintile, which is less poor when it comes to stunting rates for some of the MENA economies. Note that Yemen and Syria and Libya have very high stunting rates, and so we have them on a different scale on panel B to the right. Now, one thing we also look at is children dietary diversity, and we look at a more conservative measure on minimum dietary diversity. This is essentially the percentage of children from 6 to 23 months of age who consumed foods and beverages for at least 5 out of 8 defined food groups. So once again, we have this measure on the y-axis, and we have the level of development in the x-axis. And we can see that basically 2 of the 7 MENA economies which we have data for perform better than income peers. And of course, not surprisingly, richer countries tend to have better dietary diversity for children. Now, this speaks to an issue, an important narrative in the region, and that is food subsidies. What happens is food subsidies are not necessarily towards the most nutritious foods, and this could distort diets towards less nutritious foods in the region. And so this could be a phenomenon we see in the MENA region and also a lot of developing countries, which is the double burden of malnutrition. We have undernourishment and obesity all occurring or prevailing, concurrently in the region. Now, one more thing I want to say about child health and nutrition data is that, a lot of policymakers are flying blind. There's a lot we don't know. So when it comes to the MENA region, there is data, but it tends to be dated. So when we look at a country like Mexico that had, when we wrote this report, had a survey in 2020. And if you look at 5 years before that, taking a benchmark of 2015, we find that only 11 out of 19 MENA economies have data on child health and nutrition. Now, there have been some updates since we wrote the report, but that doesn't change this figure much. It goes up to essentially 12 out of 19 countries, but also note that Mexico had a survey in 2021, which also changes the benchmark. Now, so far we've talked about the long-term effects of rising food prices. We've then talked about the state of child health and nutrition, which is largely pre-pandemic. Now, what we do is we look at the current state of food insecurity in the region. And for this, we take data from the FAO, from the Food Insecurity Experience Scale, and complement it with machine learning techniques to come up with estimates for the past and for the future. So here I present the main results from these estimates. So what we see is that the prevalence of severely food insecure people in MENA has increased from about 11.8% in 2006 to 17.6% in 2023. And this is largely due to Syria and Yemen that are food insecurity hotspots. In the graph to the left, what we do is we take all the MENA economies and allocate to their income groups, and then we look at the average food insecurity for each income group presented by the dashed black line. Not surprisingly, Syria and Yemen have far higher food insecurity rates than their respective income peers. But what's also surprising is that when you look at upper middle income and high income countries in the MENA region, they tend to perform worse than their income peers. Using some back of the envelope calculation, we forecast that about 8 million children in the region may be food insecure in 2023. This could be a conservative estimate because of the fact that we assume poor and rich families have the same number of children, which is not always the case. We also decompose the food insecurity measure and see that inflation contributed about 24 to 33% of the forecast of food insecurity in 2023. So finally, we do discuss policy actions. We urge for urgent action. We need to act now. The cost of inaction will be compounded over many future generations, and this will be much higher. For urgent situations, better targeted cash and in-kind transfers are viable policy options. And of course, it's important to note that the long-term effects play out through children. And so mothers play an important role in this story that we tell. And so it's important to protect mothers, and policies such as maternity leave, childcare, maternal education are useful. For some countries also, there might be options to build more resilient food systems to absorb the shocks. But and then we highlight an important point, which is data. We have dated household surveys, and this increases challenges of assessing child health and nutrition in the region. And it also hurts us from having better and well-targeted policies. So I thank you for your time, and I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you both very much for an excellent presentation. And we'll go directly to Dr. Maya for her first lead, as a first lead commentator, and then we'll go to Dr. Adel Ben Youssef. Maya?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Shireen. And thank you to the authors for this very interesting report that I think highlights a very pressing issue in the region at this time. I'm going to categorize my comments actually from two different hats. The first being the hat of somebody who resides in Lebanon, which, as you saw from the analysis, has suffered from some of the worst inflation rates in the region over the last several years, and particularly food inflation, although Lebanon is unusual in the sense that this is not primarily driven by the war in Ukraine. And then secondly, from my hat as somebody who works in public health, and I very much appreciated the author's efforts to link some of these macroeconomic trends that we're seeing in the region to very concrete public health consequences, particularly for children. So from the perspective of Lebanon, again, I think the report highlights an issue that I cannot overemphasize the degree to which this is the day-to-day concern for households in the country. And as the report showed, food inflation reached 400% in late 2021, 2022, and has continued to be over 200% over the last 6 months or so. And this is despite the recent efforts by allowance by the government for supermarkets to dollarize prices, which has been very controversial, but I believe that there was some hope that this would actually combat food inflation. But from the perspectives of a consumer, I can say that one has not really seen that. And we can see on a week-to-week basis the increase of prices in the supermarket. And the bank and the different UN agencies in the country have documented the extent to which these inflation in food prices has contributed to a dramatic increase in the poverty rates in the country, which by some estimates is now nearly 3/4 of the population. And so I certainly hope that this report brings to the forefront the urgent need for policy measures that can address the short-term acute effects of this food inflation because of the long-term potential consequences. And I very much appreciated the efforts of the report also to demonstrate the degree to which we see inequality and the effects of inflation within countries and the way that this impacts the poor. I would note also in Lebanon, as well as in some of the other countries of the region, one population that is hit particularly hard is those who are displaced. And we have a very large refugee population in Lebanon, primarily Syrian refugees, but also Palestinians, who are already highly dependent on aid and are already suffering from high levels of food insecurity, even prior to the crisis. And there's also quite a bit of documentation from the World Food Programme, as well as other organizations that directly serve these populations, demonstrating the extent to which food insecurity has persisted among the displaced population, despite the widespread receipt of direct food assistance from the WFP and other organizations, which I think speaks in part to the fact that this assistance is often not sufficient in amount to meet the needs of households, and this insufficiency may be becoming worse given the rapid increases in food prices. So this leads to my first comment for the authors, which I would be very interested to hear in more detail your recommendations in terms of the targeting and funding of direct food-related transfers to different populations in the region, both the displaced populations and host country populations, particularly given that we know that there are many challenges around accurate targeting, there's many challenges around the amounts of cash transfers that are food targeted or multi-purpose. And given that we have seen sort of a push for nutritional as well as other reasons to move away from universal subsidies that do tend to concentrate consumption on essentially on carbohydrates. So this is from my Lebanon perspective. From my public health hat, again, I found the estimates very interesting, while also very depressing, and would like to, I think, further emphasize one of the points that came up in the recommendations with regards to the importance of addressing caregivers. Children are, of course, a particularly vulnerable population in terms of the long-lasting effects of food insecurity. But I very much appreciated that the authors highlighted that in order to reach children, who we really need to reach are their caregivers, and in the vast majority of cases, this is mothers. And what we really need from an intervention perspective is a more comprehensive approach to meeting the health needs, broadly speaking, and beyond nutrition of pregnant women, lactating women, and the mothers of young children in the region. And I think if we take a step even further back, what the literature shows us is that what we need in order to do that is a more concentrated effort on women's education and economic empowerment, because we know that when mothers are, the literature in public health very solidly demonstrates that when women are more educated and when they are more directly control of household assets, we see strong evidence that this tends to be better for children. And so I think the question here is, what is the package of policy recommendations that we can promote to support caregivers of young children? And related to this point, I think there's also some very interesting questions raised by this report about the subsequent health effects on children related to inadequate nutrition in early childhood, but also the health effects on caregivers. And another thing that we've seen emerging very strongly, another theme we've seen emerging very strongly from the literature over the last several years, both during the COVID pandemic and prior to the COVID pandemic, is the very strong negative relationship between experiences of food insecurity and poor mental health. And we've seen, I think, strong evidence of really devastating effects, sort of secondary health effects on the mental health and broader well-being of populations that are subject to food insecurity. And this is indicative in some sense of the stressors on caregivers of trying to put food on the table for children under the current sort of economic context in which much of the region is living. So I think in terms of thinking about policy recommendations and next steps, this broader idea of how do we support caregivers in a holistic way is something it would be interesting to hear more in the discussion. Thank you. I think I kept to my 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Maya. Thank you. Dr. Adel Ben Youssef.
Thank you very much, Shireen. I would like to thank the ERF for giving me the opportunity to comment on this very interesting and timely report. I would like also to join Dr. Ibrahim and congratulate the team for their very important work and for the policy recommendation. I was really very interested. Currently, I'm working with UNICEF in Tunisia about similar things, so I was really very, very interested. I start by general thought, then I would like to discuss 3 issues, perhaps in order to deepen the discussion. First, I think that what is happening now in our country is rooted to problems coming from last decades. It's not just because of this situation. The capacity of resilience of our economies in the region is worsening, and we can really see that there are several factors explaining this: the weak governance, weak absorption of technology, especially in the agricultural sector, and also climate change. And this is also, I would like to link what is happening and the war with the climate change effects, because the war. The timing of the war is the worst time for me. It comes after a decade of multiple crises. So, as you know, our region is a hotspot in matter for climate change, And 2022, it was the third year of drought in North Africa and some Arab countries. So when happened this year, this war, and they impacted the price of the food, because also we have this drought and we have this climate change impacting our agriculture. So the higher rate of inflation, because we have not capabilities and capacity in order to make this resilient. So I think that the link between the two needs to be done in somehow in the context of the study. My main issues are the link between inflation and the inflation and the exchange rate. I think that if we look at the explanation, okay, it may be true for some countries, but I was not feeling very good with the explanation, for example, for Morocco, because there is no big change in the exchange rate during the period studied, and the results show in important part due to the variation of the exchange rate. So I would like that some comments. Same for Tunisia, there is not a very important change in the exchange rate when we look at this period. And we found that the explanation needs this. The other thing that I would like to highlight for the macro aspect is perhaps that we have one of the explanation of the situation is the inaction of some central banks, that the policies, the macroeconomy policy of stabilization have worked in some countries, but not in the other countries. So what is the explanation coming from the action and the non-action of central bank during this period? This is for the macroeconomic perspective. I would like that the author can highlight this in the report. From a microeconomic perspective, I think that if we need to understand better the poorest consumption pattern. That means that, of course, we have high impact in matter of inflation. Of course, this is because we have seen this in the field. But at the same time, I think that there is a big change in the basket of consumption of the poor, even the poor. And some authors highlight the fact that if you look very carefully at the basket consumption of the poor, you will find, for example, most of the poor in our country are equipped with smartphone, internet, satellite, TV, etc. And those expenses are very heavy in the share of the revenue. So they feel they have problems with the food and the food security, because also they have changed their way of behaving vis-a-vis of the consumption. Another explanation is also the preference of what we are consuming nowadays. A lot of consumption are not linked to what we are producing in our countries. And this is a very important point that needs to be highlighted in the policy, because we need to educate population for food security. And we know that nowadays we need really to, we found it even in European countries, they're trying for the poor, to educate them to how to change the way of making their consumption given the inflation. So I think that we have changed the way of feeding the population, and we need the re-education of this model. Finally, I think that some countries are already extending the safety nets for children, especially in the support of the bank and the UNICEF and the African Development Bank also. Tunisia and Morocco, among others, are making some special policies for the children in matter of safety net, and this is work. So thanks again for giving me the opportunity to discuss this report, and I found it really very, very important piece of thinking for our countries.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for a very rich presentation and comments. We have a number of questions that have been coming in, and thank you, Bo and Hoda, for handling them so swiftly. Before taking the question, there's one question in particular. What would be the key messages to the donors on food security specifically? And if we take this question and perhaps give our speakers a chance to respond back also to Maya's and Dr. Adil's present comments, and then we'll take another set of questions perhaps.
Yes, we can take the questions. First of all, thank you very much for the comments, Dr. Maya and Dr. Adil. This is very useful to us. You know, we write the semi-annual reports and we have to be very concise. We can't, go into the details of a lot of things that are very interesting and very important for the region. So thank you for these comments. And I think I've gotten most of them down, but please forgive me if I missed any and feel free to reiterate if I did. So on the question of from Dr. Maya on targeted versus, targeting this cash transfers and food and in-kind transfers. This is very important. We have highlighted that better targeting is sufficiently important, is very important for the region. It is one of the areas there's room for improvement. Note that we have looked at this carefully also in our previous economic updates. It's something that we've been paying close attention to. And one of the things we did compare was essentially generalized versus more targeted subsidies. One of the findings was that, if you compensate, this is using only data from Egypt, West Bank, and Morocco, I believe, is that compensating when you look at compensating the poorest 60% of the population versus a general subsidy, you find that the general subsidy can cost about 2 times higher than just compensating just the poorest 60%. So there's a very cost, advantage in targeting better. Now, the second question, I think, was looking at public health in a more holistic manner. And this is important and completely agree with that. This is something that, we didn't have room in the report to go into much detail. We have seen a lot of literature on the importance of mental health and caregivers and so forth. On Dr. Adil, you had some questions on the macro side exchanges, which I'll let Fede handle, but a couple of points that I just want to point out is, yes, the climate change is very important. It does, have impact on food production, but do note that, when we talk about food price inflation, we're talking about really global prices. Essentially, that are raising food prices. And when we look at a lot of the countries in our region, they're small economies. They can't really affect this, prices in terms of food production. So one caveat there. On the consumption questions, what we see is that relative between poor and rich, the poor relative spend more on food items, and that plays out in the data. And that is how we look at our, different inflation in terms of different poor versus rich groups. I don't know if I covered all of it, but I can hand it over to Fede for the questions on exchange rates and on anything else I might have missed.
Yes, thank you very much for the comment. It's a very good point when highlighting Morocco and Tunisia when considering the exchange rate adjusted inflation. Now, in the period that we considered, we do see that the Moroccan and Tunisian currencies depreciated by 7.4 and 5.8% respectively, according to our calculations. And through the effect of this depreciation on tradable goods, we net that effect out, and that's how we come up with the inflation adjusted, which accounted for slightly less than those percentage points. Now, of course, like this is assuming like a perfect pass-through from the depreciation onto the domestic prices in dollars of the tradable goods, but we're also assuming no pass-through whatsoever, no spillover effect onto non-tradable goods. So by some accounts, this could be a lower estimate of this adjustment. I hope that answers or addresses Dr. Adil's concern on the exchange rate.
Excellent.
Dr.
Sorry.
Shireen, I'm happy to add a couple of thoughts, if I may.
Please do, Roberta.
Thank you. So first of all, I wanted to thank our discussants for the many good points that they've raised. And I just wanted to focus on two and elaborate on two. The first one was the question of the both discussant mentioned of moving from generalized subsidies to targeted social safety nets. And Asif already spoke about the fiscal gains of such a switch in policy. This is something that has happened in our region in the past 10 years, but not without problems. And we note that, for example, Jordan had been progressively moved away from fuel subsidies, but then things had to be reversed in December due to protests. So there is an important political economy of this type of reform that plays out in the region. One way to really marry the political economy impetus and the fiscal gain is to build social safety nets that are adaptive. And some countries, notably Morocco, Egypt, and to some extent also Jordan, have been able to strengthen the database for targeting transfers, including also families that might not be necessarily poor at the moment, but that are at risk of poverty. And the idea is to have social safety nets that are like a lung. They can expand when it's needed, and that was the case particularly during the pandemic, and it continues to be the case because of the food insecurity risk in the region, and they can then contract when these shocks subside. The reason why it is important to counteract the shocks is exactly because of what Asif presented to us. Even temporary shocks can have long-term consequences. And this is where I wanted to go and speak to the point that Dr. Maya made about the importance of having an holistic approach to children's health, which goes through mother's health and caregivers' health. This is something that tends to be often overlooked. And I hope that our colleagues who are working on health are really thinking this problem through from different perspectives. One could be the perspective of extending coverage. For example, a country like Morocco has made a specific and very explicit commitment to extending universal health coverage with a focus on mothers, but also having a holistic approach, not only a focus of women when they are mothers, but a focus on women's empowerment and education. And countries had a different success on these two angles to be able to empower women to be better mothers. And this, and I conclude here, is where a lot of the intergenerational effects that can come from a temporary shock, long-lasting consequences to this generation, then can have effects on the next generation. Some of these costs are kind of silent and unseen, and that's why we wanted to estimate them and give them a sort of economic cost of inaction to really make them visible. So thank you for now.
Thank you very much. We've got like 5-6 questions, so I'm going to be very telegraphic, and perhaps we can also be telegraphic in response. There is first question is from Dr. Zakaria Mansouri, and in terms of policy intervention, should we target first and second quantiles in a micro fashion in order to reduce inequalities and poverty, or should we allocate resources in the traditional macro way? There's also a question with regards from Dr. Amal Karaki. Does the report include an assessment of the deteriorating food infrastructure that exists in some MENA countries and which may contribute to increase in food prices? There's another from Dr. Amin Mohseni, and there's an indication there that in the report, there's not been a distinction between food quality and food quantity. During times of hardship, families often substitute food quality with food quantity. Did the authors take that into consideration? And I think Bo is addressing that directly in the interest of time. There's another one. In many countries suffering from high levels of debt, how will this further affect the food insecurity and capability of households to accommodate with the high food inflation? And finally, there's one from regarding impact of sanction regime on Syria food security resilience and its effect on child health. And I think, yeah, Hoda's addressing the final one, so I can give a chance to our panelists to respond. Yes, floor is yours.
Thanks, Shireen. These are many questions, and I'll try and best to answer them as best as I can. So we have questions on regards to in terms of calorie intake. Yeah, so we're looking at food insecurity that's more about going hungry. When you look at the food insecurity experience scale, this does not differentiate on the quality of food at all. What we did look at is child dietary diversity, and that is essentially where we try to get at this idea of of how good these diets are and what these calories sort of mean. Now, there was also another question on, deteriorating food infrastructure. Now, there's a whole conversation happening on regards to building resilient food systems, and we don't do it that much service. We just, mention a bit of policy and what should be done in a very generic way. The main thing to also note is that, there is scope, yes, to build resilient food systems, but these food prices are determined globally that affect domestic prices. So there's not that much scope in some ways in terms of the food prices, and there's always options of building better food systems and also protecting people. And in this report, we do put a big focus on the human capital angle on this story. So let's see, and what are the questions? So on the debt, I can give that to Fede if you'd want to come in. But one last thing on Syria and food security resilience. When we came up with our estimates of food insecurity in the region, a large portion of that is due to the situation in Syria and Yemen. And so yes, we understand the urgent situations in food insecurity we see in both of those countries. Thank you.
And on the debt question, this is a very interesting and difficult question. But one aspect that is critical is that countries that find themselves with high levels of debt currently, given the rising global interest rates, might find themselves with less capacity to respond to crises and to lend support to those vulnerable. And so this goes back to perhaps the message we've echoed on targeting assistance in order to make it also less costly for the government while lending support to those who need it the most. But yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We're perfectly on time. We've got 2 minutes. So if Dr. Ibrahim and Dr. Roberta would like to have a last word, and we'll be closing on time. Dr. Ibrahim?
Thank you very much, Shireen. I just want to, before I, thank everybody and really, express my, keen interest really to continue this collaboration and to engage the academic and policy community. I wanted, if I may, just to take the issue of the macro, especially the exchange rate, a little bit further. Because I know this is not the intention, but it could be construed that exchange rate adjustment is naturally inflationary, and that actually it's a serious concern. I'm saying this because in a few countries in the region, exchange rate reform is off the table. It's in many countries. And this has actually huge implications for the competitiveness and the growth potential of many of our countries. I think the important thing to highlight is that actually the reason why exchange rate adjustment was found to be inflationary, because successful exchange rate adjustment usually requires that it's part of a package, especially fiscal adjustment. What has happened in many of our countries is that because suddenly the parallel market becomes so prominent, and it sent very powerful signal, not only about that the macroeconomy is not under control, but also it actually threatened the, it's a threatening signals to economic regimes and political regimes. And so they had to do something to unify the exchange rate, but without a sufficient fiscal adjustment. There are other experiences where Chile, for example, during the copper boom, exchange rate was adjusted naturally because it was following inflation targeting, but it wasn't inflationary, and it actually allowed the economy flexibly to provide jobs in agriculture and industry when actually, sorry, not the copper boom, the copper bust, when actually many workers were laid out from the private, copper mines. That is one example, and there's so many other examples in many countries in Asia. So I just wanted this point to be made clearly in the future that actually, it shouldn't be construed as if the main reason why we have inflation was because of the exchange rate adjustment. Thank you very much.
Roberta, last word. Thank you,
And
Dr.
my only last words are thank you for the hospitality and thank you for the food for thought that will also be helpful as we prepare for the MENA economic update in October. So thank you very much for your time and for all the feedback.
Thank you all and have a great evening, and the full proceedings of the event is accessible online. Thanks for everything and have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.